Okay, class, we're going to get started with our first observational contour drawing. So what's going to be different between this drawing and the drawing you just finished today is that we're going to be trying to balance looking at our object for half the time and then our working surface for the other half of the time, right? So what we want to avoid is staring at our paper for too long in this process. Just like we were doing with our blind contour drawings, we really want to focus on the contour and getting that as accurate as possible at the beginning before we start to kind of move into anything like shadows or highlights later on, right? So for this drawing specifically, we're going to focus on just working on our contours and getting that as accurate as possible. So whenever we're doing our contour drawing, the first thing we want to do is get into our mind that we're going to be working general to specific. So the object that I'm working with today is a deflated beach ball that you may have seen on the image library if you check that out today on our Google Drive link. So it is a little bit more of an irregular shape, but it is still fairly recognizable, right? So it's kind of like a sunken in sphere, and then we have a pretty unique contour going around this thing. So what I'm going to look at first whenever I'm looking at my object is kind of try to figure out what the height and width relationship is with my object. Is it kind of like a flat horizontal object, or is it a tall vertical object? And what this is going to help me do is it's going to help me set up a size relationship. So whenever I am rendering my object, I can tell if my proportions are off based on the relationship that I've determined, right? So before we jump into any kind of drawing, let's go ahead and determine that now. So from looking at this object, if I were to take a quick look at it, and even just looking at it for a split second, I can tell that it is a little bit wider than it is tall, right? So one good way to measure that would be to hold your pencil kind of in front of you and then put your pencil up to the far left edge of your object, and then move your thumb to where the edge of your thumb is on the far right side of your object, right? So once we have that measurement, we can take that measurement and then apply that to our vertical distance. So if that vertical distance is shorter than our horizontal distance, that means we have a horizontal object, and that's wide object. So whenever we're drawing this thing, that's one good way we can check to see that our proportions are correct, right? If it's wide in our drawing and it's wide in our object or in the photograph that we're working from, we know we're at least kind of on the right pace and the right step, right direction to making this very accurate drawing. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to go ahead and start off by looking at my object and then trying to figure out where some kind of key landmarks are. So our key landmarks are going to be kind of features on our object that are very unique and are just kind of good places for us to jump in, right? So good entryway. So for me, on this beach ball, I do see that where that blue section is, there is a little bit of a slant there. So I'm going to go ahead and track that that diagonal first. I'm going to start off with kind of a high point here. And then it looks like there's another kind of peak where the weight of the ball kind of bows out down here at the bottom. So I'm going to track that landmark. The bottom of my ball is just slightly to the left of where this top peak is. And then if I'm looking at that right side, I'm going to try to track and see if there's any other kind of landmarks that I can kind of pick up. So one thing that I do notice is that from this kind of center, and when I say the center, I'm kind of looking at where that right side of that yellow panel kind of hits the red cloth. That for me is kind of dead center. And then whenever this ball starts to kind of pick up, it looks like it on the right hand side, it actually picks up a little bit higher than it does on the left hand side. So this is kind of like my 4 landmarks that I've kind of mapped out. So based on this information, before I can move any further, I kind of want to look at my width to height relationship and see if what I said the first time still matches up with what I said earlier, right? Is this object a nice wide horizontal object, or is it taller than it is wide? So from looking at this, I can say, okay, this distance from here to here to here is probably about 2 1/4. And if we take that same kind of application. We're at about just 2 exactly. So this width is slightly wider than my height, which checks out based on the logic that I set up a second ago. So I think we're good to go. The next step is going to be to try to render this whole outer contour first, and then we're going to jump in and start to look for more kind of landmarks. So from this really kind of high top here, I noticed that my ball kind of deflates in this way a little bit, and then it kind of bows out. There's like a little bit of a hump right here, collapses a bit, and then it bows back out into like a little bit of a peak here, and then we kind of have a little bit of a flat moment. And then here, it looks like the weight of the ball kind of comes out at the bottom, and it kind of creates this roundness, right? Portion of my beach ball here is kind of at the bottom there. And what you saw me do there, this kind of light scratching, is just almost kind of like a gestural mark to kind of drop in this connection between that little peak there and then the connection between this kind of bottom half. Typically I'll say try to avoid any kind of scratchy motions. That's usually whenever we're talking about kind of excessive motions. So excessive kind of scratching. So we kind of want to avoid moving around our object like this, where we're kind of scratching in. It almost kind of looks like our object is fuzzy. We do want to try to make some pretty deliberate motions as we're kind of coming through here. And at the very beginning of our contour phase, we are just kind of trying to develop a general kind of sense of form. And we can always kind of come back in here later on and then fix any little kind of inconsistencies or any mistakes that we're making. So I've connected my left landmark to my center here, and I'm going to keep that energy moving through. So as I kind of look in here, one of the things I said was that the bottom of the beach ball kind of seemed to pick up a little bit higher on the right-hand side than it does on the left. It's kind of, the photo's taken at an angle. It's almost kind of like an oval shape, not a perfect sphere. So I'm going to kind of make sure that that logic follows through. I noticed that the ball kind of sinks in a little bit there. It's kind of a key moment. It's where we start to kind of see this infolding of the beach ball. So I'm going to just drop that one small detail in before I move on. And then I'm going to come back up here. And then as we come back up this way, I think right about here, there's another little bit of a diagonal moment that starts to happen. So this is my outer contour, and then now I'm going to just kind of come back in here and darken this up a little bit so that we can see it. At this phase, I would say it's because we are working with a contour drawing. It's okay if we have really bold contours like this. As we move into our next unit and we're working in value and we're trying to drop in our shadows and everything else, we're going to want to try to break this reliance on a super heavy contour so that we can use our shadows and our highlights to get rid of these lines. But I won't get too far ahead of myself. So now that we have our outer contour, now I want to kind of look for details inside my object that'll make this thing look more and more like the ball that I have in front of me, right? So whenever we were rendering our outer contour, we were looking for landmarks on the outside that kind of told us what this thing looked like from the outside. So now we want to do the same thing on the inside. What are some really key moments on this ball that will give us ultimately the information that we need to make this thing look as realistic as possible? For me, the more I look at this thing, the more I'm really kind of drawn to that little suction point right here in the middle where you inflate the ball. It's kind of a darker blue than the blue next to it, and it is kind of like this central point, right? It's almost like a crater also wherever I hit this thing. So that's what I'm going to focus on rendering first, and then once we have that little circle, kind of contorted circle drawn in, then we can radiate out our lines from that point and kind of give this thing a little bit more of a sense of being sunken in, right? The contours that we see coming off of that blue line, the red line, the yellow line, and then even those kind of white shapes are going to kind of really create that illusion for us that this thing is a textured object and it is kind of sunken in, right? So if I'm looking at that circle there, it isn't dead center. As a matter of fact, what I said earlier was that this kind of yellow section of the beach ball for me seem to be kind of where the perfect center of this object is. And then our blue circle is actually just to the left of that. So that's one thing that I can kind of gauge for placement, is where that thing is relative to that center line I talked about earlier. So I'm gonna take that line here and I'm gonna say, okay, this is kind of like my axis, it's my central point. So now I wanna kind of set up where that blue circle is in relation to that center. So another thing I can do now to kind of get that perfect center for my horizontal length is try to find where the perfect middle is on this horizontal side. So if I'm looking at this ball, I'm gonna say where this indentation is, maybe slightly just below that is where my first kind of horizontal marker is at the halfway point. And I'm gonna try to track a moment on the right hand side, which to me kind of looks like it's gonna be right about here, is where I wanna draw my horizontal axis. And our circle sits just slightly above that. So it's just slightly in here. And it's not a perfect circle. It does kind of cave in a tiny bit there. And then it kind of pulls back out this way. And then we have it coming in through here. So that's where my little inflation tube is. And now that I have this, every other line that is on the inside of my beach ball will actually kind of radiate out from that point. So I'm going to spend just a little bit more time looking at this, and I'm going to try to gauge the contour that I've set up on the outside and make sure that it's going to make sense with what I'm about to do next. So for instance, if I'm looking at the distance between this central point and my outer contour, and it looks like maybe I overdrew this shoulder here, like maybe this distance from the edge of my blue to the edge of my ball is a little bit too much, this would be the time to make that adjustment, rather than getting super deep into the drawing and then later figuring out, okay, well, maybe I should have fixed that earlier on, right? So for me, I almost kind of want to say that maybe this isn't the issue, but maybe it's more of an issue, I would say here, that it comes in maybe a little bit, I kind of threw it out a little bit too wide. So I'm gonna draw a little X right here to tell myself this is not the contour I want, this is the contour that I want here. So whenever you guys are working on your drawings and you're making these corrections, for this drawing, I want to see those corrections. If you did have to tweak your drawing, let me see those marks. Let me know that you did correct it. Don't erase any lines. But whenever you do find out which line is the most accurate contour, try to make that line a little bit bolder, and then we'll keep some of these mistakes a little bit lighter so we can tell the difference between our correct marks and our incorrect marks, right? The more accurate contour and the less accurate contour. So what I'm going to track now, starting from here, I'm going to focus on this kind of blue section that I have in this left kind of quadrant here, and I'm going to try to track that contour as close as I can. So this is kind of where the blind contour almost kind of comes back in. We're tracking our drawing on our paper, and then as we're drawing this, we're checking back in with our photograph, or we're checking back in with our object in front of us and making sure that that contour is accurate. So when I'm looking at this, I see two peaks, and then I see kind of a little bit of a dip right in here, and then another dip right before it hits this blue center kind of suction point or inflation point. So that's one contour down. The next one is actually a lot easier. It's almost just kind of like a small kind of upside down J, like a sweep that takes us out from the center, and it just kind of carries us through the curve of this ball. So I'm gonna just drop that in real quick. And it's not really a drastic kind of a contour. It's a pretty slow sloping line right there. So now that we have this blue knocked in, I want to kind of focus on moving on to this red section here. So if we're looking at size relationships as we move through, things that we can check and quantify as we move through to make sure that we're getting the most accurate drawing possible, I can tell that my blue section is my smallest section, when I get to this red section of the beach ball, it's like the medium-sized section, and then once we get down to the yellow, this yellow is closest to us, and it is the biggest kind of section that we have to render. So that's one thing that I could use. That's one little kind of visual cue that I can pick up on and say, that's how I'm going to check my size relationships. So before we get to this red, there is this one kind of really deep fold that I'm seeing between the blue and the red in this kind of white section. So it's a pretty big white section here in the middle, but there is a really sharp crease. It's kind of coming through here, which is actually what's giving us this kind of peak right in here. So what's happening at this section is that we have a really sharp crease in the ball, and it gives us this little peak in the shoulder. So we'll fix that contour, put a little X through here, and then we'll kind of darken this a tiny bit. And then we'll move into our red section. So the same way we had this kind of really nice sloping contour for our blue, we have a very similar thing happening on this outer edge of the red. So on this top edge, my red line is pretty close to this crease, but it is a more of a kind of a sloping line. So what's happening to this line is that it's actually wrapping around our form, right? So it wouldn't be a straight line because this part of the object is starting to get rounder. So this line is going to continue past this contour behind the ball. So whenever we're drawing our contour, we do kind of want to render that curve and make sure that our lines look like they are going to wrap around this object. So as we kind of hit that outer edge, that red line looks like it's tucking just behind that edge there. So when we move down here, remember whenever I was drawing my contour that I said this is kind of a unique moment where it looks like the ball really kind of caves in and folds in on itself. That's going to affect how I render this next part of my contour. So what I'm going to do here is the same way that I rendered this crease before I did this contour, I'm going to try to follow this crease in here and follow it through the duration of my ball so that I know how it starts to affect these other sections. So this crease in here, kind of a high peak here on this first section, and then it has like a little bit of a slow curve through the center of the ball, and then it kind of picks back up this way, and then the shadow is really kind of what gives me the end of that crease. So you see some waves kind of coming in through here, and then I'll just let that one kind of ride like that. So because this is just a crease, and I do want to make my my color contours pop a little bit more, I'll probably keep this line light, and then I'm going to make this contour for my color shape a little bit bolder, and I'll do the same thing in the blue so that I can delineate what's what. So now that I have this crease dropped in, I'm going to move to my red contour, the outer edge of that red contour, and then it looks like my crease is going to need to change based on what I'm seeing in front of me. I'm kind of looking at this distance from the center to where my red line kind of starts to bow a little bit. So what I've drawn doesn't quite match where my crease is. So at this point, let it ride, and we all make mistakes, and we'll make those corrections here in a second. So one thing to evaluate here is if I were to move this contour up a tiny bit more to kind of match that hit on the crease on the ball, I would make this whole red section smaller than my blue section. So before I set up a size relationship or a size rule that I wanted to follow and say, this is the smallest color section, medium, and then this is my largest. So if I were to adjust this red section would be smaller, which means I would need to correct my blue, right? So instead of doing that, the easier fix is to fix this crease, and we can do that later on. So I'm going to come in through here, and then as soon as my red contour hits that crease, it looks like it kind of picks up and bows. And then just like this one kind of curved along the edge, we're going to do the same thing to this bit of my contour. So it's looking pretty good. We're going to fix this crease. I'll probably bring it into about here. Looks a little more accurate. And then now we can move on to our final yellow section. So I'm going to go ahead and come in here. I'm going to beef that up quite a bit. So I know this is my red section. And what I'm using right now is I'm actually using a charcoal pencil simply for the purpose of making this easier for you to see it, right, whenever I'm working on my contour drawing. So whenever you're working on your contour drawing, make sure that you are doing kind of like your light sketches with your HB pencil. And then as you make these darker, your contours darker, you can move up to like a 6B or your 8B and make these lines a lot bolder as we move through. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna focus on the rightmost contour of my yellow shape here. So I'm gonna focus on this contour here. So just like before, I'm kind of taking into account how this crease is going to affect that contour, and it looks like that line comes down right about here, comes down a little bit further, and then it hits that crease, and it comes back out again, out this way. There's another crease here that it kind of rides out on, and then it tucks back in, and then it kind of follows out to the edge, and then it wraps out on the outside. So that's kind of what I'm seeing, is a little bit more of not so much a straight kind of diagonal, but there is some small moments in there that make this line a little bit more interesting, a little bit more dynamic. So now that I have this, now I want to move on to my my leftmost yellow contour here. So from that one, once again, we have another crease coming in through here, and it's going to kind of bow out a tiny bit there, and then my yellow contour is going to kind of hit a little pudge right there, and then it actually kicks back out this way. So there's a couple moments on here where we have some pretty heavy creases that start to influence how our lines look. Okay, so I'm pretty confident with the way that yellow shape looks. And basically where every one of my color shapes look and start to hit. So the most general thing we could have done, like I said, we're working general to specific. Most general thing we could have rendered was this outer contour. The next largest thing in our composition to render are these really big kind of color shapes inside of our ball. And now that we have those kind of bigger shapes on the inside, now we can start focusing on where some of these creases are in these shadow shapes. So that's what I'm kind of looking at now. I'm pausing and then I'm trying to see, okay, where exactly are these really big shadow shapes in my composition that are really going to kind of come in handy later on. So we're going to start to map out some of these shadows, and we're going to map out some of these highlight shapes as well. So the first one that kind of jumps out at me, starting back in this this corner where we started first, kind of in this first quadrant, you can say second quadrant, third, and fourth, and we can just kind of move around that way to make things a little bit easier. So if I'm looking at this first quadrant, to me there's a shadow shape that really jumps out right about here that kind of hits my blue shape, and I'm going to keep these contours a little bit lighter. So we're gonna map that one out. It kind of comes in through here a little bit more, then we hit a peak up here, and then it carries us through the second quadrant, and then it hits this crease and it comes back in through here. So that's kind of one shadow pocket that I'm seeing right now. Okay, in my second quadrant, there's a couple that I see in here that are just little dimples on the ball itself, on the red shape. There's kind of like this line that comes through here. There's a little bit of a shadow pocket here. And then as we start to come into this bottom half of the ball, there's a pretty large shadow, right? So we have our light coming in from the top. I lit this from the top, so it makes sense that the top half of this ball would have more light than the bottom. So as I'm working through, I do start to see these pretty heavy shadows start to kind of materialize. So if this is my center line here, it looks like we have a pretty heavy crease coming in through here that hits just left of that center, and it kind of peaks right in there. and then it picks back up this way, and it's pretty sharp shadow. Peeks out again, and then it kind of hits out this way. So once I have these shadow shapes kind of starting to develop and drop in here, you can see how it can start to get a little bit confusing. So at this process, before say I'm in the planning phase of my larger drawing or my full drawing, I can start to say what's what, right? So we can call this a shadow, and then just put a little S in here to tell us what's what. This is also a shadow. This huge area here is a shadow, so I'm going to put an S here, and an S here, and an S here, and we'll try to track some more shadows that we're seeing. So I see another one kind of coming in right through here. So I'll put a shadow mark there, and that's what I got so far. So the next biggest shadow that I see is actually the shadow that the ball itself is casting onto the red cloth. So since we have a lot of the information in here pretty much knocked out, I'm going to move into that shadow shape, and it's pretty big. So I just repositioned my photograph, and this shadow is going to fall off the page based on what I drew and where I placed my beach ball. This thing's going to fall outside of my page. So this is kind of an important moment in the drawing process where a lot of art students have a hard time because they want to cram everything into the picture plane, right? So that's one of the rules I'm going to teach you guys to break right now, is that if something kind of falls outside of your viewing space, let it fall off and don't try to squeeze it in. So when I say don't try to squeeze it in, on the photo that I have here on the screen, you can tell that the shadow is pretty big. But our tendency is going to kind of want to be to make this thing fit inside of the page. So whenever somebody squeezes a shadow in, they might do this maneuver and draw kind of like the right beginnings. Like this shadow might end up starting in the right place. But if we're comparing our drawing to the photograph that we have in front of us, if we're looking at our landmark and saying, okay, well, this is the bottom of my shape, the bottom of my shadow should be way out this way, way down here, off my page. So we just want to let these things fall off the page if that's the case. Look at that distance relationship and follow through. Even if it feels a little funny to not leave it on the page or to not draw it down here, just let it happen, right? We're going to take this line, we're going to carry it off the bottom of our page, and then this line here. This edge of my shadow I could actually probably still render. If you guys can see the shadow, it kind of peaks a little bit here on this right hand side, but it definitely still falls off the page. So if I were to draw it, obviously my pencil would be down here and drawing it through. Sometimes it helps to kind of, if your drawing paper is smaller than the surface that you're working on, you can kind of extend that out or draw past your paper. But let's just kind of imagine carrying that contour off the page, down here towards the bottom, and then coming back up. And then obviously this is a pretty big shadow, so I'll put my S right here to tell me that this is a shadow, right? So that's the basics here. Obviously there's a lot more details in here that I haven't picked up yet, but for right now I think this is a pretty strong base to work from. It's a good structure to work from, and I would feel confident throwing in some values on this rendering. If you wanted to kind of have a setup similar to what I have here, all I did was I took my drawing piece of paper and then I put it on just a plank of wood. So if you guys go to Home Depot, you guys can get a piece of wood like this. It's cut down to like an 18 by 24, and a plank like this would cost you maybe $5 or $10. But it's a good drawing surface to work from versus leaving a sheet in your sketchbook. This is kind of hefty, and you can prop it up somewhere or hold it in your lap and work that way, which is always better than kind of working flat on a table. If you can kind of meet your drawing face on and you're kind of sitting upright, I think you're in a better position to do some really good rendering. So that's the demo for today. You can use any image that I have on the image bank. If you want to set up your own still life, what I did is I have this pedestal here on the side, and I'm going to pan to it, and it'll kind of seem like an awkward chop. But I have a pedestal off to the side where I have my iPad set up, and then where I'm referencing it, so you guys can see the distance between my drawing board and my iPad. It's pretty close, so I want to be able to move from my drawing board to my screen with very kind of little motion, little movement to my head. So whenever you are setting up your still life, or you're setting up your object, keep that in mind, that you don't want your object to be like 20 feet in front of you as you're trying to render this thing, right? You want it to be close to you, so it's easier for you to draw and easier for you to move back and forth between your paper and your object. So for this exercise, you really only need to do, we'll say minimum one object, but if you want to do more than one object, feel free to jump in. Whenever you're picking your object, you can do a practice one, but I do want this drawing to kind of be a stepping stone for the next unit or the next exercise that we do. So once we're done with this contour, if you're feeling pretty confident about it, we can save that one, or if you feel like you maybe want to try again with another object, we can move on to another object and then use that second drawing as our basis, or kind of like a jumping off point for our shading and our value unit later on, right? So let's go ahead and end it there. And this drawing, you don't have to have done until next week. So we'll say by Monday, if you guys can finish it over the weekend, we'll be in a good spot.